Those of you who've been following the channel know that one of the points of focus here is getting a better understanding of the socio-political movements in our country that are growing in discontent and distrust with our institutions, not just the government, but mainstream journalism, big tech companies, and their influence over our speech, and really getting a better grasp of the variety of how people are thinking through the problems in our country and also what are potential solutions. And so I had this woman who's a self-described anarcho-capitalist reach out to me. I'll be honest with you, I've never had an in-depth conversation about anarcho-capitalism. So curious what you think about this. Definitely, as always, leave me a comment in the comment section. But without further ado, here is Hannah Forseen. I did a quick search. To me, my first reaction was this is libertarianism on growth hormone. So I want you to tell me, what is this exactly? And then we'll get into why we're even talking about this today.
Well, anarcho-capitalist, it is a libertarian philosophy. So you have some libertarians who believe in a limited government. Those are minarchists. Anarchists believe that the state is illegitimate at its core. Obama said that government is the monopoly on violence, and anarcho-capitalists believe that that makes it illegitimate. Everything the government has or does is actually only able to be accomplished through the use of force. Like it's backed up at a base level by using force against its citizens. Anyone who would choose to peaceably object or disconnect are going to face, the guns of the state. So yeah, I believe 100% in free markets and free people. And while a stateless society will not be a perfect utopia, I believe it is the best conditions for human peace and prospering.
One of the reasons that I was interested in talking to you is because when you reached out to me on Twitter, you mentioned discussions happening online related to secession.
Now we're already seeing a balkanization happening. I think it was the Hill ran a headline recently that there's a state in, or sorry, not a state, a county in Colorado that wants to secede from Colorado and join Wyoming. There was another headline of a county in Missouri that passed a law that their local police are going to arrest any federal police that enforce gun laws. And so we already see this balkanization on a state level. South Dakota actually, their House of Representatives just introduced a bill that any of the executive orders Biden passes, they're going to review and vote on whether they're going to accept or reject them. So there's already, the federalist process. Federalism is, part of how the country was founded, that there's a lot of power in states and in local municipalities to govern themselves. And so we're seeing people already start to move in that direction. And I think that, we all kind of recognize that our political and cultural climate is very precarious right now. And I think the conversation would be best served if we could entertain ideas of decentralization, secession. You could do it along state lines, that already exist, but you could do it in many other ways as well. The primary goal for me is to, attack kind of this leviathan of central power that rules over all of us, and decentralize that and empower individuals, local communities, people who are already like-minded to govern themselves in the way they see fit.
As someone who is anti-force, I guess, is that an okay way to describe it?
Yeah.
Okay. How does this happen without there being some kind of civil war? Because obviously our history, we have an example of secession, right? And
Mm-hmm.
So how do you foresee that happening without there being any kind of violent conflict?
I think that the best way to do that is through national conversation. Essentially, people didn't believe Brexit could happen until the vote came in. Everyone was shocked, and then Brexit's happening. They kind of even did a second vote to be like, "Are you guys sure? You want to leave Europe?" So I do think that we have political options, but I think it's limited right now because the conversation isn't being allowed to happen. The corporate press and the Overton window is very narrow, and it is designed to keep everyone in believing that secession would inherently involve violence, or that it's just impossible altogether. So I think when you get a critical mass of people enforcing their rights, in their local communities, I think that's where you start seeing, either the government will go full totalitarian, crazy, or you have to let people politically break off.
What happens to the people who are in your area that don't want to secede? Do they have to move, and how does that all work out? What if they can't afford to? And then my next question after that is, say you do figure all that out, and I'm curious, do you foresee this as some states remain intact, or it could even be a dissolving of the state itself? So Texas could become 4 different states. I know in Washington, where I live, the east side of the Cascades has been trying for a while to turn itself into Liberty State, or the State of Liberty, whatever they call it. I'm not totally sure, but that's not new out here, where we live on the east side of the Cascades. So they want to become their own state from the west side, and it is a very politically uh, different and divergent reality depending on what side of the mountains you're on, which is interesting. But I think partially that has to do with population and urban centers and whatnot, and our side is much more rural. um but yeah, so is it just the states remain intact but they aren't part of this federal system? Is it even the states dissolve and they become, what people decide? How does that even happen? And when you do that, how do you then organize to provide things like a municipality does? Do you just go to sort of the city structure? And then what about, for instance, like, what's the healthcare system look like in an area like that? Just that would be sort of the higher thing that people are talking about, sort of the issues that people are talking about, what government should provide. But let's go to the more basic level, talking about road systems and water treatment, and how do you communicate with the municipality next to you, because and like environmental laws and all of that stuff, because you may be using resources that are now, instead of having some kind of bird's eye federal oversight, now we've got a ton of different municipalities that are going to be arguing about what does clean water look like, what should food growing look like, all of that stuff. So how do you keep that from just being a complete nightmare?
Essentially, the first question would be, how will the secession look? What will the breakdown of actual boundaries be? As an anarcho-capitalist, my ideal would be a stateless society. Everything would be privatized, and so it would be based on private property rights, different things like that. So, as far as until we get to that stage, decentralization, how that looks, I think that can be done a myriad of ways. Kind of the essence of anarchy is that your citizenship doesn't need to be tied to your geography. It can be tied to your worldview or your political affiliations, consensual political relationship. And so, that's why I believe in the future, freeing ourselves of geographical, constraints will be an ideal system. And you can do that through both technology and private property. As far as, people always have basic questions. Yeah. How do you, fund the roads, build the roads, that sort of thing. And what people don't realize is all of our roads are built by private companies now that are just contracted by the government who uses our tax dollars. So by getting rid of the government, you're cutting out a middleman and you're employing those people directly. There's Walter Block has a lot about the roads in particular, but there's no service that the government provides that a private entity can't provide. And so it would take, maybe some cooperation in the neighborhood. We have things like community watch right now. So in the future, maybe that's what your security looks a little bit more like, is cooperation with those who are in your immediate vicinity, or paying for private security. Right now, there's a Detroit Threat Management, is a private entity that does security, very affordable. The whole goal isn't to, enforce laws, and that sort of thing. It's to provide protection and security for people who want themselves and their property protected. So we do have a lot of private entities that already exist and are providing these services. We just, most of us aren't aware of it. And, I kind of believe we're a little propagandized by our education system and the corporate press into believing that the only viable producer of these goods and services is the government. And I think that's not totally accurate.
What about if you live at the base of a river system and your corporation that you're talking about that you're paying to do A, B, or C is dumping its toxins into the water, but it's somebody else paying that corporate system, I guess, to do that, and they're not necessarily regulating, and they're not doing it. They're not. There's no government oversight of that. Which, granted, as an environmental reporter, even with government oversight, that kind of stuff happens all the time. But just to say, now you're downstream from some other area, and you want them to stop doing that. There's who steps in and says, "Hey, you got to stop dumping arsenic in the river. I live downstream. I like my fish." Who says you can't go to Hannah's front yard and shoot her and take all her vegetables? Like, what happens in that world?
Yeah, one, I would compare it to what we have today. With government regulations and oversight, that doesn't prevent these things from occurring. But instead, what it does is it creates a cushion from accountability where it's very hard for an individual to hold a big corporation accountable. By privatizing law, by having arbitration, by having an entirely free market where people could compete, by having, by privatizing police, you would have multiple different enforcement mechanisms, to actually provide accountability for someone who is transgressing against your private property rights.
Somebody who is very new to this topic, I want to make sure I completely understand, because it does seem like there's a little bit of this in the early pre-revolutionary mindset of the folks who were leaving England and were like, we want to rule ourselves. What if somebody says, hey, if this could be done, it would have been done, and there's a reason we ended up with 50 states and a federal government?
We actually do have some level of examples. For 2,000 years, Ireland was a stateless society. The Wild West is considered, this Hollywood version of violence and, crime, but really it was a lot more peaceful than we are portrayed. So there are examples where it's worked.
Well, Hannah, real fast, let me just cut in, because I guess I should have qualified that by saying, in recent times, because obviously when you can move to an area where I live, yeah, you're right. Back in the day, hundreds of years ago, even maybe 150 years ago, there was no, there would have been no neighbors of mine down the street, right? So I didn't have to figure out who was going to tell my neighbor what they can and cannot do on my property, vice versa, right? We're all trying to now live in societies that are far more concentrated than they were before. So with today's modern population standards, can you name examples in the last, say, 150 years where on a scale this has happened, not just, some commune in the middle of the desert somewhere?
No, there's none that I'm aware of. But as far back as the 1800s, Lysander Spooner, who was an early anarchist, he said, and this is, to speak to the question of why not just limit the government and put on these constitutional restraints. And Lysander Spooner said, the Constitution has either authorized the government we do have or been powerless to stop it. So either way, it's not fit to exist. So I think that the idea that this very powerful entity that has a monopoly on the use of violence, that has access to resources, I would say unjustly, to believe that it's going to limit itself, to me is a little bit irrational. It's kind of it's the fairy tale we're told about the American myth, but we see where that's gotten us, a couple hundred years later.
How about the people who are currently taking care of, like, say, a child who's born into a family that is abusive, doesn't have any money, and ends up custody of the state? What do you do with people who need help? Are you assuming that there's just going to be enough nonprofits, enough just caring people that are going to take care of everybody? What about those folks? How do they not get left behind?
That would definitely be an issue, and it's a problem that you would have an entire market of people to work together and try to solve. So before the state took over these sorts of social programs, it was all private charity, mostly religious funded, or it would be local communities, and that sort of thing. So, especially with the technology we have today, I think it would be easy to find ways to connect people and try to bridge those gaps. And the the anarchists, having a stateless society isn't necessarily saying that there is one answer for every problem. It's freeing as many people to work on solving that problem as possible.
When we're seeing both the left and the right almost united in this kind of, I don't want to call it like an overthrowing of the institutions, but a significant distrust of who's in charge right now. Whether, like I said, is it oligarchic corporations? And hey, that's another question I have for you. Like, how do you keep your system from going in that direction where you replace government with tech companies, for instance, who are now, going to be our overlords instead of the government. And actually, interestingly enough, I think Nevada has this new bill where, if it goes through, I think the tech companies are going to be allowed to create their own governments. So it is kind of, moving in that direction. So how do you avoid that? But let's first start with how does this fit into that world that I've been talking about on my channel of kind of these similarities you're seeing on the populist left and the populist right?
We've had this swell of populism that's come, and I believe it really started kind of turn of the century. But it's reaching a fever pitch to where you're right, people are rejecting our institutions. In your most recent video where you were talking with Quincy, I believe, you're talking about this portrayal that the corporate press is giving everybody about what the political landscape is. And I would say that's more of a funhouse mirror version of what people on the ground actually believe. Um, so we had through both Bush and Obama this huge expansion of our foreign policy, of our welfare states, and that also coincided with some bailouts that happened. People forget that George W. Bush was also bailing out some corporations, and I believe he might have done a small stimulus to the people as well, kind of in the wake of 9/11 and how that had affected the economy. And he had this quote that said, "I'm abandoning the free market to save the free market," which anyone who knows Austrian economics knows that's nonsensical on its face. So you have this, I think, at that time, you have this cultural kind of marginalization of conservatives and Republicans. And, Bush is just this redneck Christian, moron who's sitting there with the nuclear codes and he can't even pronounce the word, and so you have this cultural marginalization that's already happening of people. Meanwhile, you have this, economic marginalization that's happening, and I think a lot of people don't connect those dots. And then you have the crash of 2008, and you have Occupy Wall Street, is pops up on initially by, kind of like a transpartisan, but then becomes a very leftward populist, sentiment. On the right, you had the Tea Party, that as soon as they were successful in getting some politicians elected, then were branded as racist, and they only dislike Obama because they're racist. And then actually Obama's IRS audited the big players kind of out of existence, and that kind of is what killed the Tea Party, to my understanding. So you have these economic woes, and you have this political momentum that's growing on both sides, and then you have, in my opinion, a very one-sided cultural marginalization that's happening towards one, basically one half of the country, of anyone who calls themselves conservative. And so I think that you had this ground that was laid for Trump Bernie right versus left populist election cycle. And thanks to the DNC emails, we know the DNC did not play a fair game with Bernie, and so then the populism was only able to be expressed via Trump. So you had Bernie Bros that went the Antifa route. You had some that went, kind of mainstream establishment Democrat, and then you had some that crossed the aisle and supported Trump. And actually, Trump and Bernie, policy wise, weren't hugely different. They're economic protectionists. Trump actually ran in the primaries as Medicare for all. Things that average, everyday working people have concerns about. How am I going to keep my job? How am I going to pay for my health care? So you have this, this populist moment we're living in, and Trump, you know, fortunate for some, unfortunate for others, is the face of that. And so that takes the culture war to this new height that it hasn't been before, to where conservatives, anyone who's MAGA feels genuinely persecuted, like their job is in danger, their, social standings in danger, all these different things, as a result of having a political persuasion. And so what I'm concerned about is, I think a lot of people are as well. We know that this culture and political war that's being waged is not sustainable on a long term basis. So the question is, instead of continuing down this path that seems, ripe for tragedy, what's a better solution? And I feel like what the establishment is trying to tell, people on the right is the way to have peace and not violence is by you submitting. And I don't believe the populist right is willing to take that anymore, and they're not interested in it. So I think instead of continuing to stoke these tensions, instead of continuing to have this battle, this metaphorical battle, and prevent it from becoming a literal one, the best idea is to promote the idea of voluntary and peaceful disassociation. You don't need to rule over your neighbor, and they don't need to rule over you. It is much better to just disengage and self govern.
Well, I think 2020 showed us too that the populist left is not taking it that like
Right.
sitting down either, right? So, uh, okay, so back to the other side of my question, which is how do you prevent your private entities that you're relying on from becoming your new overlords? Going back to the tech companies, for instance, now that are governing our conversation. How do you just not replace one government for another, basically?
It's not a concern to dismiss entirely, and the left anarchists have very valid critiques of major corporations. But what most people don't realize is corporation is a status that was created by the government and is granted to these companies. So, one, the idea of a corporation and many of the benefits that come along with it wouldn't exist. Secondly, with an entirely free market, there would be a lot more room for disruption. And instead of waiting on, passing certain regulations and this entirely slow, very non-responsive to public will entity called government trying to come in and wrangle these corporations, you would have no barriers to entry into the market. You would have, people basically would, the market responds to, in a way that's democratic, that, if you have everybody move to another company, or create different alternatives, there isn't any naturally occurring monopoly, is what I'm trying to get at. Any monopolies we've seen in the past have been essentially either created or maintained via the use of the government. If they're just not a naturally occurring economic phenomenon. So you don't have the issue of that. And then you don't have the issue of a corrupt government system, bailing out failing corporations, regulating competitors out of the market, creating barriers of entry so no one can even compete. So there would be, it would be an evolving situation, but a company has to compete for your dollar, not just on, say, I sell you gasoline, and if somehow I magically got a monopoly, I have to compete. Maybe I don't compete with other people who sell you gas, but I have to compete with anybody who creates a different technology, like an electric car, or you have other things you have to purchase in your life. So you can only be so unreasonable. There would be creative destruction in the market. So there's an economic premise that's creative destruction. That when companies such as like the banks regarding the bailout and the crash of '08, those companies made very bad choices. They sold bad loans. They repackaged those loans and sold those and made money off that. And then when everything crashed, instead of having any consequence for their bad speculative behavior, the government comes in and bails it out. So a lot of the fears people have of a truly free market, their concerns are actually, if they look around, those things are occurring today, but we have this government system, and I think this is part of what contributes to this populist moment, is people are starting to realize The government is not responsive to the will of the people. So even if they get their guy voted in, the whole apparatus keeps him from being able to be their voice.
Going back to 2016 and the primaries and seeing how Bernie Sanders was treated by the media, and just and that idea is not even his perspective on socialism isn't even that much different from, say, Europe, for instance. So it's not even so out there, like it's never existed before or anything. And even that was very hard, it seemed, for sort of the mainstream establishment conversation to want to allow into this inner circle. And then even, say, somebody like a Tulsi Gabbard in, the most recent Democratic primary, or Andrew Yang, who, wouldn't go down sort of the identitarian ideological perspectives of some of the sort of mainline left, but presented UBI or ending the wars. Okay, like these are not Looney Tune ideas, right? Right. But even that, oh, you're an Assad toady, you're a Russian agent, so I'm just curious, how does your idea of just burning it down, and dissolving all of it together, like, how do you ever get a seat at the table?
Yeah, well, I don't want a seat at the table. I want the table to be dismantled. So
but how do you do that if you don't get a chance to go to the table and turn it over? You know what I mean?
Right. Well, I think you bring up some really great examples. That even Tulsi, who she was branded as, yeah, like you said, Assad, she's an Assad apologist, or maybe she's working for the Russians. I think what you see with a lot of those people that the establishment is rejecting, is an anti-war stance. And I think that there's a vested interest, there's a lot of money and a lot of power in our warfare state. And so I think, a lot of people, have this general non-interventionist mentality, that's kind of exists in the populist sphere. But anybody who reflects that on the national stage is chewed up and spit out, marginalized in many ways. And so I think that that's one of the reasons you see that's a commonality. I think, let's see. Oh, sorry, I blanked on your question. There was something else I was going to.
No, it's okay. Well,
sorry.
back. Yeah, go ahead.
I recall. So the other thing too is there's a Noam Chomsky quote where he says something to the effect of, the best way to keep people obedient and docile is to create a very narrow Overton window of what is the appropriate political conversation, but allow a very lively debate within, to give the appearance of free thought. When really what you've done is marginalize anyone who has any beliefs that are outside of those parameters. And I think that was actually really well demonstrated in the video clip you covered of Brian Stelter, because his point was, get rid of the pollution, get rid of what I consider disinformation, and then we can debate about this tax percentage or that tax percentage.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons that I'm very hopeful about not needing a seat at the table, right, and getting these ideas to more people is that, one, technology has democratized the political landscape in a way that politics never has. They are terrified because they are losing a grip on the conversation. You see, what was it? MSNBC, I believe, was the one, had someone on who was saying maybe podcasts need to be regulated. There was an article that said, these encrypted communications like, Signal and Telegram, maybe those need to be regulated. They're terrified of regular people having a conversation that cuts out their control over the narrative that, is totally free of their agenda.
The frustration and anger is moving a lot closer to the center. I got to tell you, it doesn't seem like it's just the five people on either side, right? So that's why I'm interested in understanding the convergences and what it sounds like and looks like from the people who are talking about it, that are not, your average mainstream corporate news panelist, because I don't know if they have a firm grasp on all of that. So I appreciate your taking the time to talk about it. Is there anything else that we didn't discuss that you would be interested in sharing with people?
Yes, I am very concerned. I believe we are seeing a campaign from the intelligence community via the corporate press to to stoke fears of right wing extremism specifically. And I believe it's to justify future either violent or tyrannical behavior towards, its citizens. I think that, people on the right are being very mischaracterized, and, they will soon be desperate. And that's why I want to have this conversation. I want people to know that there should be an option to pursue that is peaceful and is just disassociating, just decentralizing, just shoring up, a community of like-minded people. And I think it's very dangerous, the way they are trying to preemptively excuse bringing the war on terror home. I think you had said it was Talib who was concerned about expanding the powers of the national security state because we know that citizens lose civil liberties as a result of those actions. And so I know that people on the right are very concerned.
Hope you like this conversation. Definitely leave me a comment in the comment section, like, share, make sure you're subscribed, and there are links in the description for how you can support my work. I will see you next time.